Today's pattern is a cute top with center front ruching, a gathered empire waist, back invisible zipper, and elasticated short sleeves. This is Simplicity 8880 View D. I love that the fabric that I chose looks just like the one on the pattern envelope. It's a lightweight cotton. I recently got a couple yards in this yellow color and in blue from AliExpress. If you haven't checked out their fabrics, they have a huge selection at incredible prices. Silky satins, ribbed knit, pre-quilted fabrics, corduroy, and loads more. I also got this pretty viscose, which I'm planning to use to make a dress, and it came with a free half-yard sample of another pretty viscose. I'll leave the link to AliExpress in the description below so you can add to your fabric stash too. Join me in making a sweet top to feel pretty in. Let's get started. Here are my bodice front and front lining pieces. Along each of the top edges, we're going to stay stitch, just stitching within the seam allowance. Onto the wrong side of my front bodice piece, I've transferred my stitching line from the pattern piece. I'm going to pin along the stitching line just as I would a dart. Then we're going to baste from the top to the bottom of the stitching line using the longest stitch on your machine and leaving tails of thread on both ends for gathering. Pull the basting stitches so that this section measures 3 inches. And then tie your basting stitches. Then we can press this seam open. Place your side front pieces right sides together with the front piece, aligning the notches and pin in place. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Place the back bodice pieces right sides together with the front bodice, aligning the notches. Pin and stitch in the same way with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, pressing the seams open. Place your front and back yoke pairs right sides together, aligning the notches and pin in place. Sew these seams at 5/8 of an inch and press them open. I'm using the same main fabric as my lining, so I'm going to pin and sew the yoke linings in the same way. Here is my main yoke and here is the lining. I'm going to place them right sides together and pin the outer curved edge. I'll sew this seam at 5/8 of an inch and then press the seam toward the lining. I've repeated the process to create my opposite yoke piece, making sure as I'm using the same fabric for the main and the lining that the way that I've pressed those seams mirror each other. Then we're going to understitch the center seam allowance, sewing the lining to its seam allowance about 1/8 of an inch away from the original seam line for both sets. Fold each of your yokes along the main seam and give them a good press. Then we're going to baste the raw edges together for each set. With right sides together, pin your yokes to the main bodice piece, aligning the notches and matching the raw edges. Note that the lining, the understitched side of your yoke, should be facing you. Repeat on both sides. Then sew each of these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Construct your bodice lining in the same way as we did for the bodice main, placing the side fronts and the front right sides together, aligning the notches, then sewing at 5/8 of an inch and pressing the seams open. Then pinning and sewing the side back linings to the front lining, also at 5/8 of an inch and pressing the seams open. Along the bottom of the lining piece, press the raw edge to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch all the way across. Then trim that hem material to 3/8 of an inch. Place your bodice lining and the bodice main right sides together, aligning all of your seams and the top raw edges and pin in place all the way across. Now we're going to sew along the top edges with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim your seams. Clip into your curves. Also clip into your center front, careful not to clip through the stitching line. Then we're going to understitch the lining. Flip the lining over the seam allowance. Then we're going to sew the lining to the seam allowance underneath at about 1/8 inch seam allowance for the center area and both of the sides. Fold the main fabric and the lining along the main seam line so that they're wrong sides together, and press those top seams. In the center of the armholes, we're going to baste the materials together. From the outside of the front bodice piece, from dot to dot as transferred from your pattern, we're going to stitch in the ditch of that gathered dart. Place your lower front and lower back pieces right sides together, matching the notches. Pin in place. Repeat on the other side. Sew both side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Then at both side seams, I'm going to finish both sides of the seam allowance separately. Along the top edge, we're going to baste from outer notch all the way across to the opposite outer notch. Use the longest stitch on your machine and leave tails of thread at the beginning and the end. We're going to attach the lower bodice piece to this upper bodice piece. First, make sure that the upper bodice lining is out of the way. Then place the basted lower bodice piece along the lower edge of the upper bodice piece. Right sides together. Match the side seams and the outer edges and pin in place. And then pull your basting stitches so the lower bodice piece fits the upper bodice piece. Then we'll sew the upper and lower pieces together from one side all the way across to the other side with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Press the seam up toward the upper bodice. Before I install the invisible zipper, I'm going to open it up and iron both sides of the zipper tape so that the teeth open out away from the tape. I'll open out my bodice lining up and away from the main fabric, then turn it to the right side. Before I start attaching the zipper, I'm going to finish the raw edges of the lower bodice piece along both center back edges. Now I'll place one side of the zipper right sides together with the main bodice fabric so that the top zipper stop is at the main seam line. Because the width of my zipper tape is 1/2 inch and my seam allowance is 5/8 inch, I'm going to place the edge of the zipper tape 1/8 inch away from the edge of the main fabric and pin in place. Using a zipper foot or an invisible zipper foot, sew from the top to as close as you can get to the bottom of the zipper. Now that one side of the zipper tape is installed, place the remaining zipper tape right sides together with the opposite center back and pin in place in the same way. Then sew the opposite zipper tape in place close to the teeth from top to bottom, just as we did for the other side. Then at the top of the seam line for the center back edges, we're going to fold back the lining so it's right sides together with the main fabric, with that pre-pressed inner hem still folded under. Pin in place from the top to the lower back seam line. Then using a regular zipper foot, sew from the top to that folded inner edge of the lining, sewing close to those zipper teeth. Repeat that process for both sides of the zipper tape and then trim those upper inner corners. Then we can turn the lining to the inside of the garment. Now on the inside, that inner folded edge of your lining should just be covering the main stitching line. You can use a needle and thread to slip stitch that lining in place all the way around, or you can stitch in the ditch from the outside of the garment. As you're stitching in the ditch of that main seam line, just make sure you're catching that bottom inner edge of the lining as you go. For the bottom edges of the center back below the zipper, place those fabrics right sides together and pin in place from the end of your zipper stitching to the bottom raw edges. Using a zipper foot, sew from the end of your zipper stitches to the bottom with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Along the bottommost edges, we're going to sew a narrow hem. First, we'll press the raw edges to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch all the way around. Then once that's pressed, we'll open it out and turn that raw edge to meet the crease line. Then fold it on the crease line and press once more to form the narrow hem. And then edge stitch close to that upper inner fold all the way around. To prepare for creating the casing along the bottom of the sleeve, I'm going to draw myself a stitching line 1 5/8 of an inch away from the bottom raw edge. Now I'm going to finish those short outer edges. Then I'll place my finished edges right sides together and pin that short seam at 5/8 of an inch. Then press the seam open. To form the elastic casing along the bottom of the sleeve, we're going to use 1/2 inch single fold bias tape. I'm going to fold back one of the short edges of the bias tape to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch and place the folded edge at the sleeve seam. And I'll place that bottom folded edge of the bias tape right along the line that I've drawn. Then we're going to edge stitch the bias tape along both edges all the way around. Once you've sewn all the way around and you're back at the seam on the other side, trim off the excess, fold back the edge by 5/8 of an inch so that both finished edges of the bias tape butt up against each other at the seam. I've cut my sleeve elastic using the elastic pattern piece. Now I'll use a tiny paper clip to lace the elastic through the opening in the binding. Then I'll stitch the short edges of the elastic together to secure. Pull the elastic entirely into the casing. Using a needle and thread, slip stitch the opening in the casing closed. We're going to hem the bottoms of the sleeve in the same way as we hemmed the bottom of the garment. Forming a narrow hem, I folded the bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch. Then I'll tuck the raw edge underneath to meet the crease. and edge stitch in place along the inside all the way around. Along the upper edge of the sleeve, we're going to sew basting stitches from lower notch to lower notch, using the longest stitch on your machine and leaving thread tails on both ends. With my sleeve right side out, I'll place it right sides together with the bodice, which is wrong side out. Pin in place at the underarm seam and the notches. Then begin to pull your basting stitches so that the sleeve fits within the armhole. And continue pinning in place. I'm going to sew my sleeve in place with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, allowing subtle gathers around the sleeve cap. Once it's sewn in place, I'll finish the edges all the way around. Repeat to attach both sleeves. And now the top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.